Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. Imagine the stillness before dawn, June 4th, 1942. Darkness still clings to the horizon over the Pacific, yet aboard 4 massive Japanese aircraft carriers, activity hums with quiet intensity. Picture young pilots, barely more than boys, strapped into their cockpits, inhaling the damp ocean air, their eyes scanning the dim blue sky. In nearby ready rooms, others hunch over target maps, absorbing every last detail before takeoff. Meanwhile, deck crews and mechanics scurry like shadows across the flight decks, making urgent final tweaks to the aircraft that, in moments, will thunder into history. They cannot know how, could they? That just 240 miles to the northeast, 3 American carriers are already turning into the wind. Launch preparations are underway. The trap is being set. What was intended to be Japan's crowning blow, the annihilation of U.S. carrier strength in the Pacific, will instead unravel into disaster. A battle meant to cement dominance will, by sunset, become an obituary for Japan's naval dreams. 4 of the very same carriers that struck Pearl Harbor will vanish beneath the sea, leaving behind twisted steel, leaking fuel, and over 3,000 lost souls, airmen, sailors, the very heart of the Imperial Navy's striking force. Alongside them will sink the vision of Japanese supremacy across the Pacific. This moment was no accident. It was the climax of 6 months of triumphs. But today, we turn the lens not to the victors, but to those who paid the price, to the admirals who orchestrated the plan, the pilots who took to the skies, and the deckhands who would never return. This is the story of the Battle of Midway told from the losing side. Now, journey with me 2 months earlier, Tokyo, spring of 1942. In the austere meeting rooms of the Imperial Navy's headquarters, a storm brews. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, stands face to face with a wall of opposition. Heated debates echo through the chambers as the Naval General Staff push back against his vision. The public may still be drunk on victory, but Yamamoto knows better. Beneath the surface, cracks are forming. Yes, the Pearl Harbor attack had dazzled the world. A stunning, almost mythic, tactical feat. But Yamamoto's mind is haunted by what didn't happen that day. Not a single American aircraft carrier had been present. USS Enterprise and USS Lexington were at sea and had escaped unscathed. And now, half a year later, those same carriers harassed Japanese forces with impunity, defying the illusion of total dominance. Then came the thunderclap, April 18th, a date etched into the memory of every officer in Tokyo. American B-25 bombers launched from the USS Hornet roared into the skies over the sacred capital. The Doolittle raid, a brazen strike that shook the empire to its core. Though the physical destruction was limited, the psychological damage was catastrophic. Tokyo had been touched, the emperor's sanctum violated. Who would bear the blame? Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, once hailed for leading the Pearl Harbor attack, now stood on shaky ground. Accusations circled. Why hadn't he launched a third wave? Why had he failed to locate the American carriers? And now, Tokyo bombed under his watch. The weight of expectation and failure pressed heavily on his shoulders. In the high chambers of military power, conflicting visions clashed. The Naval General Staff, ever wary, favored a cautious advance through the South Pacific, solidifying control over the Solomons and New Guinea. severing lifelines between America and Australia. Logical, methodical, safe. But Yamamoto saw a different path, a bold stroke, born of urgency and foresight. He had glimpsed the ticking clock in the distance one few others even recognized. Time, he knew, was the enemy. Why? Because Yamamoto had lived in America. He had walked the grounds of Harvard, served in Washington, and journeyed through the industrial heartland. He had seen the sprawling steel mills of Pittsburgh, the ceaseless rhythm of the shipyards in Newport News, the vast plains capable of feeding an empire. He understood what Japan truly faced, not just a powerful foe, but a giant awakening. And that's why Midway was not merely a plan, it was a necessity, a gamble he believed they had no choice but to take. Try to imagine this. A storm is coming, but only one side can see the clouds. For Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the storm was not metaphorical. It was industrial, cold, mechanized, relentless. He had seen it with his own eyes. The American machine, vast and insatiable. He had walked the floors of U.S. factories, observed the infernal rhythm of Pittsburgh steel mills, and marveled at the boundless output of the Newport News shipyards. He knew deep in his bones that once awakened, America's war industry would become a tidal wave too powerful for Japan to resist. And so, in a chillingly prescient moment in 1940, Yamamoto had told Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe, "If we are ordered to fight, I can promise a hard fight for the first 6 months. But beyond that, 2 years, 3 years, I have no confidence at all." His warning was not hollow, it was prophecy. A year later, in September 1941, he sharpened his metaphor. For a time, we'll stretch in every direction like an octopus extending its tentacles, but no more than a year and a half. And what was the solution? Operation MI, the assault on Midway Atoll, Midway. Just 6 square miles of coral and sand, yet more valuable than gold. Situated Barnalawan 100 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, it was the westernmost American base in the Pacific, a forward refueling point for submarines and aircraft. But to Yamamoto, it was something even greater. Bait. If captured, the Americans would have no choice but to respond. And when they did, the Imperial Navy would strike, sinking the carriers that had escaped Pearl Harbor. A decisive, climactic engagement. The Kantai-Kessen, the grand fleet battle that had always been at the heart of Japanese naval doctrine. But this would not be a simple punch. It would be a vast, intricate dance of forces. A sweeping operation across thousands of nautical miles. A main invasion fleet tasked with seizing Midway, a carrier force to crush American air power, Yamamoto himself leading the battleships of the combined fleet aboard the colossal Yamato, and a decoy strike against the Aleutian Islands to scatter American focus. 200 ships, the largest Japanese fleet ever assembled. The plan's operations order ran over 700 pages, delivered just days before departure. Officers barely had time to absorb it, let alone question it. Some did try. Rear Admiral Motomu Ugaki, Yamamoto's own chief of staff, staged war games in early May. The results were sobering. In the simulation, American carriers arrived earlier than anticipated and inflicted devastating losses. But the exercise umpires, perhaps infected by hubris, simply waved it away. American hits were minimized, and sunk Japanese ships were magically returned to the board. The outcome was rewritten. Even Minoru Genda, the tactical genius behind Pearl Harbor, raised red flags. The plan was too complex. The carriers were vulnerable. He was ignored. This was victory disease, the subtle poison of overconfidence born from 6 months of unchecked conquests. At Coral Sea in May, the Japanese believed they had sunk 2 American carriers. In reality, only the USS Lexington had gone down. They assumed USS Yorktown was crippled beyond repair, out of the fight for months. What they didn't know, what no Japanese officer could have imagined, was that 1,400 American workers at Pearl Harbor labored day and night, bringing Yorktown back to fighting shape in just 3 days, a feat Japanese yards couldn't dream of. Japanese intelligence concluded that only 2 American carriers could oppose them at most, and so they advanced, underestimating not just their enemy's resources, but their resolve. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the man tasked with leading the carrier strike force, wrestled with gnawing doubt. He was no carrier strategist, a torpedo expert promoted by seniority, not expertise. His discomfort with naval aviation had shown at Pearl Harbor, where he had aborted a 3rd strike that might have crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet completely. Now he faced an even more daunting mission, with fewer resources and a weary force. His carriers had been nearly non-stop at sea since December, attacking Darwin, raiding Ceylon, crisscrossing the Indian Ocean. His pilots were drained. His ships needed rest. Worse, the Battle of the Coral Sea had left scars. Though Japan claimed victory, the Shokaku had been severely damaged and required months of repair. Her sister ship, Zuikaku, had lost too many planes and crews to participate. 2 of Japan's best carriers absent from Midway. We are being asked to do too much with too little, Nagumo confessed to his chief of staff, Captain Ryunosuke Kusaka. The Americans have had time. Our pilots are tired, and we don't even know where their carriers are. Yamamoto-san is gambling with the fate of the empire. And the deadliest flaw of all, it wasn't the ships, it wasn't the planes, it was ignorance. The Japanese didn't know the Americans were listening. From a windowless basement in Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo had been reading Japanese naval codes for months. JN-25B, the Imperial Navy's cipher, had been compromised. Rochefort knew about Operation MI. He knew AF was the target and, through the famous water ruse, confirmed it was Midway. He even knew when the attack would come. Admiral Chester Nimitz had in hand the Japanese order of battle. He placed his carriers accordingly. The Japanese submarine screen sent to detect departures from Pearl Harbor arrived too late. The American carriers had already slipped through. A planned reconnaissance of Pearl by long-range flying boats, Operation K, was canceled. The refueling Point French frigate Shoals was no longer safe. U.S. destroyers USS Thornton and USS Pringle sat right on top of it. In March, 2 Kawanishi H-8K flying boats had bombed Oahu from that very location. But Nimitz had learned. The trap was now set, and the hunter would become the hunted. What blinds a warrior more than arrogance? Perhaps only belief in his own invincibility. In the final days before Midway, the last glimmers of warning, the flickers of intelligence that might have unveiled the trap, were steadily snuffed out. Signals pointed to rising American submarine presence near the atoll. Radio intercepts revealed a surge in communications between Pearl Harbor and Midway. The ease with which American forces had located Japanese ships during the recent Coral Sea battle suggested that their codes may have been compromised. Yet these signs, glowing like embers in the dark, were brushed aside. The Americans are too stupid to crack our codes and too cowardly to fight unless they outnumber us 3-1. That was the prevailing sentiment among some Japanese officers. The expectation was clear. The Americans would arrive only after Midway had fallen, and by then it would be far too late for them. May 27th, the anniversary of Tsushima. On this sacred day, echoing the legendary triumph of Admiral Togo over the Russian fleet in 1905, Nagumo's Kido Butai, the carrier striking force, slipped from the tranquil waters of the inland sea. 4 carriers, veterans of half a year of domination, set sail. Akagi, Yamamoto's former flagship and now Nagumo's command center, Kaga, once a battleship, now reborn as a carrier, and the swift sisters Hiryu and Soryu. Aboard these ships were 248 aircraft, including 21 Zero fighters destined for Midway. Of those, 225 were fully combat-ready, flown by the most skilled and battle-hardened naval aviators in the world. These were the men who had stunned the United States at Pearl Harbor, ravaged the Indian Ocean, and brought war from Hawaii to the shores of Ceylon. Who could stand against them? And yet, as Commander Minoru Genda, Nagumo's brilliant air operations officer, prepared for the mission, still weakened from a recent appendectomy, he penned a somber final entry in his diary. "We sail with heavy hearts. This operation has been rushed. Our intelligence is poor. The plan is too complex. But we are samurai. We will do our duty even unto death. May the gods protect Japan, for I fear we sail toward catastrophe." Perhaps the most haunting emblem of overconfidence lay in the person of Commander Mitsuo Fuchida. The same man who had led the Pearl Harbor strike, who had once shouted, "Tora! Tora! Tora!" was now sidelined. Just days before the operation, Fuchida underwent an emergency appendectomy aboard Akagi. Weakened, grounded, he could only watch from his sickbed as the mission unfolded without him. Later, he would claim to have sensed that something was deeply wrong, that a shadow hung over every preparation. The timing felt rushed. The air felt thick with foreboding. Historians would later scrutinize Fuchida's memoirs, challenging their accuracy. But regardless of embellishment, a truth remains. Unease had begun to ripple through the heart of the fleet. June 3rd, under the murky skies of the North Pacific. Far to the north, 600 miles from Midway, the Aleutian Islands operation began. Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta's 2nd Carrier Strike Force launched air raids from Ryujo and Junyo against Dutch Harbor in Alaska. This was meant to be a grand feint, a mighty diversion to draw American forces away from Midway, but the ruse had already failed. Admiral Chester Nimitz, armed with decrypted messages and unwavering clarity, had seen through the smoke and mirrors. He kept his carriers at Midway, where the true battle would unfold. The elaborate Japanese deception had fooled no one except the Japanese themselves. As Nagumo's carriers sliced through the fog, they maintained total radio silence, no messages, no coordination with the other arms of Yamamoto's scattered plan. In the dim glow of ready rooms, pilots made final preparations. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, who would lead the initial wave, reviewed aging reconnaissance photographs. The pictures were weeks out of date, but they showed what mattered: fuel tanks, airfields, defensive emplacements. What they didn't reveal was that Midway had been reinforced. New aircraft, new bombers, and most critically radar. A U.S. radar station, newly installed, would detect the incoming strike 93 miles out, plenty of time to scramble fighters. That same evening, American patrol planes, the venerable PBY Catalina flying boat, sighted elements of the Japanese invasion fleet 700 miles west of Midway. At Oronakana 25, Ensign Jack Reed made the call. Sighted main body, bearing 262, distance 700. Midway's defenders were electrified. They had seen the enemy, yet Nagumo's carriers remained hidden, cloaked by storm fronts and distance. On the bridge of Akagi, Chief of Staff Ryunosuke Kusaka cautiously approached Nagumo. "Sir, if the Americans have spotted the invasion fleet, they may be more alert than expected." Nagumo waved the concern away. "They are supposed to see the invasion force. It will lure them out. Tomorrow, we destroy their air power. And when their carriers come to fight, we will finish them." But even as those confident words passed Nagumo's lips, far to the northeast, another man was making his move. Admiral Raymond Spruance, aboard USS Enterprise, was already setting the trap. He and Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher had defied every Japanese calculation. Their three carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the miraculously repaired Yorktown, had reached their secret rendezvous point, Point Luck, northeast of Midway. They were exactly where Japan didn't expect them to be, already at sea, already in position, already preparing to strike. The weather was perfect. The ocean was calm. Visibility stretched for miles. At 0430 on June 4th, aboard Akagi and Kaga, the first wave launched. Everything went smoothly. The launch deck roared to life as 36 Aichi D-3A Valdive bombers, 36 Nakajima B-5N Kate-level bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi A-6M Zero fighters soared into the rising sun. Lieutenant Tominaga led the formation into the dawn, circling once above the fleet before setting course for Midway 240 miles away. As the last aircraft vanished into the horizon, Nagumo faced his first critical decision. Doctrine demanded a full deck load strike, but Nagumo hedged his bets. He kept 108 aircraft in reserve armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, just in case American ships appeared. It seemed like a wise precaution. It would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. Below the rumbling flight deck of Akagi, the man who once led the raid on Pearl Harbor lies confined to a sickbed. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, sidelined by surgery, watches the launch of the first wave with a growing sense of dread. His body may be healing, but his mind is alert and deeply uneasy. Though no official record captures his exact words, fellow officers later recalled his visible concern. The operation felt rushed, incomplete, unready. And now the fleet was flying into uncertainty without its most experienced strike leader. His absence would be felt in the hours to come. Above him, at 0500, Admiral Nagumo sends out 7 scout planes to search a vast and treacherous ocean. 7. That was all. By contrast, the Americans had deployed over 30 PBY Catalinas in their hunt. One of Nagumo's scouts, Tone's number 4, assigned to the sector where American carriers actually lurk launches 30 minutes late. Catapult issues, engine troubles, bureaucratic slowdowns. The cause is debated, but the consequence is beyond dispute. That single delay will cascade into catastrophe. Ironically, some modern analyses suggest that even a timely launch might have missed the American task forces altogether, yet fate was not so generous. At 0534, the veil is lifted. Lieutenant Howard 80, flying a PBY, spots the Japanese carriers and transmits a message that electrifies the American command. Enemy carriers. By 0552, his update paints a clearer picture. 2 carriers and battleships, bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles, course 135, speed 25. On board USS Enterprise, Admiral Raymond Spruance makes a bold decision, one that will change the course of history. The enemy is almost 200 miles away, far beyond normal striking range. But Spruance acts immediately. He orders a full launch. His planes will barely have the fuel to return, but that doesn't matter. If he can hit the Japanese while they're recovering aircraft from the Midway strike, the impact could be devastating. Meanwhile, at 0553, radar on Midway detects the incoming Japanese wave 93 miles out. Sirens wail, pilots scramble. The island's defenders prepare for their moment. The defenders rise to meet the onslaught. At 0616, Marine fighters intercept the first Japanese formation. Major Floyd Parks leads a ragged group of just 20 Brewster F-2A Buffaloes and 7 Grumman F-4F Wildcats, outnumbered and outclassed by the escorting Zeros. Parks' final transmission echoes with grim determination. Hawks at Angels 14, supported by fighters. But the battle is one-sided. The Zeros, with their superior agility and elite pilots, carve through the Marines. In minutes, 13 American fighters are down. 4 more are crippled. Major Parks is among the dead. The Japanese lose only 3. At 0630, Lieutenant Tominaga's bombers reach Midway. The attack is brutal. Dive bombers ignite fuel tanks, level structures, and gouge craters into the airstrip. But as Tominaga circles overhead, something gnaws at him. American aircraft are still taking off. The runway, though damaged, is usable. More importantly, none of the American planes were caught on the ground. At 07 Ora, Tominaga sends a fateful message to Nagumo. A second strike is needed. Just then, American aircraft begin their own assault on the Japanese fleet. 6 TBF Avengers and 4 B-26 Marauders carrying torpedoes swoop in. The Zeros pounce. 5 Avengers are shredded, 2 Marauders fall, but one Suzy Q, flown by Lieutenant James Murray, dives straight for Akagi. Witnesses describe the bomber roaring the length of the flight deck, its gunners strafing, cutting down 2 sailors. The plane pulls up just in time, scraping past the bridge where Nagumo and his staff duck for their lives. Suzy Q survives despite 500 bullet holes and a loss of hydraulics, miraculously returning to Midway. A second B-26, piloted by Lieutenant Herbert Mays, is less fortunate. He crashes into the sea near Akagi's bridge. Some believe it was a deliberate ramming attempt. Captain Kusaka would later say, "It was as if the war god had given us a warning." More attacks rain down. Major Lofton Henderson leads 16 Marine dive bombers. 8 are lost. 15 high-altitude B-17 strike next, scoring no hits. 11 Marine SB-2U Vindicators follow, again repelled. None hit their mark. But the pressure is relentless. The Japanese carriers are forced to maneuver wildly, disrupting flight operations. At 0715, Nagumo stands at a crossroads. Tominaga's message has arrived. A second strike is needed on Midway, but no American carriers have been seen. The planes in reserve are armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs meant for ships. After intense debate with his staff, Nagumo makes a fateful call: rearm for land attack. It's a direct violation of Yamamoto's standing order to remain ready for anti-ship combat. Below decks, chaos erupts. Hangars become powder kegs. On all 4 carriers, ordnance crews scramble to remove torpedoes and 800 kiloless armor-piercing bombs, replacing them with lighter bombs for ground targets. There isn't time to return unused ordnance to the magazines. Instead, bombs are stacked in corners. Torpedoes are lined up along bulkheads. Fuel lines snake across the decks, refueling aircraft in the middle of this flammable mess. As one airman would later testify, it looked like a bomb factory. one spark, and we'd all be dead. At 0728, everything changes again. The long overdue tone number of 4 Scout finally radios in, sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, bearing 010, distance 240 miles, course 150, speed over 20 knots. Nagumo immediately replies, ascertain ship types. 12 minutes pass. 12 agonizing, precious minutes. Rearmament continues amid the clutter. At 0745, yet another American wave descends. 16 Marine dive bombers from VMS B-2401. Half are lost. But again, the Japanese are forced into frantic evasive maneuvers. They still cannot launch. Nagumo is cornered. His fighters are low on fuel and ammo. His Midway strike group is returning. His decks are jammed with aircraft in various stages of rearming, and now American surface ships, perhaps carriers, are approaching. At 0809, Tone Scout finally confirms 5 cruisers, 5 destroyers. Relief washes over Nagumo. No carriers. He gives the order to continue preparations for a second strike on Midway, but at 0820, a chilling correction arrives. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Nagumo's world shudders. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding from Hiryu, immediately responds at 0830. Consider it advisable to launch attack force immediately. Yamaguchi sees the peril. He urges swift action. Every minute of delay increases the danger. But below deck, Nagumo's strike groups are a shambles. Some planes are armed for land attack, some have torpedoes, some are in pieces. And the hangars are a minefield of exposed bombs and fuel. Nagumo hesitates, and with that hesitation, the trap continues to close. Imagine the chaos, the heat, the noise, the stench of fuel and sweat and fear. On board the carriers of the Kido Butai, the tempo is frantic. Fighters are running low on fuel and ammo. Tomonaga's strike group is returning, and still there is no clear sign of American carriers. To launch now would mean committing a partial disorganized strike, many planes without proper armament, and none with fighter escort. It would be a violation of every principle that guided Japanese carrier doctrine. Despite his recent surgery, Commander Minoru Genda is consulted. His response is urgent and clear. Launch now. Speed is everything. But Captain Ryunosuke Kusaka urges caution. If we go in piecemeal, we'll waste our strength. Better to recover our aircraft, rearm, and strike with full force by the book. Nagumo, ever the conservative, sides with Kusaka. He sends the signal. After recovery of aircraft, we will proceed north to engage the enemy. It seems logical, measured, prudent, but it is a fatal mistake. At 0837, Tomonaga's damaged planes begin returning. One by one, they land on the decks. They are struck below to be refueled and rearmed for the next attack. Down in the hangars, fuel hoses crisscross the floor. Bombs are laid out near aircraft. Torpedoes stacked in corners, regulations tossed aside in the rush. Elevators shuttle planes between decks like pistons in a war machine. But no one notices what approaches through the morning haze. At 0920, the first American carrier aircraft appear on the horizon. 15 TBD Devastators from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8. Led by Lieutenant CMDR John Waldron, they fly low and slow obsolete aircraft. Barely 100 knots above the sea, no fighter escort, no hope of surprise. The Zeros dive. What follows is a massacre. Each torpedo plane is picked off like a duck in a shooting gallery. All 15 are destroyed. Of the 30 crewmen, only one survives, Ensign George Gay. Floating alone in the Pacific, hidden beneath a seat cushion, he will witness the unfolding cataclysm. Not a single torpedo hits, but Waldron's courage is not in vain. The Zeros have all been pulled down to sea level, fully engaged, unaware of what is coming from above. At 09:54, 14 more devastators from Enterprise arrive. Led by Lieutenant CMDR Eugene Lindsay, they too are savaged. 10 are shot down, 4 barely escape, no hits. At 10 Hora, Yorktown's VT-3 appears 12 devastators under Lieutenant CMDR Lance Massey. 10 more are lost, again, no hits. Of the 41 torpedo bombers launched by the 3 American carriers, only 6 make it back. It's carnage. But the skies are now clear of Zeros. On the bridge of Akagi, there is relief, perhaps even a sense of triumph. The Americans have attacked and been annihilated. At 10:30, Nagumo gives the order. Prepare for launch. Victory seems within reach. But then the sky changes. High above, unnoticed by any lookouts, 2 groups of SBD Dauntless dive bombers begin their descent. Lieutenant CMDR Wade McCluskey, leading 33 dive bombers from Enterprise, has gambled his fuel searching beyond the calculated intercept point. He finds the destroyer Arashi, speeding to rejoin the fleet after attacking the submarine USS Nautilus. McCluskey follows its wake straight to Kido Butai. At the same moment, from another direction, Lieutenant CMDR Max Leslie leads 17 SBDs from Yorktown. They, too, arrive above the Japanese carriers at precisely the right time. At 10:20, a cry erupts across Akagi's bridge, "Hell divers!" But it's already too late. At 10:22, McCluskey pushes his stick forward. From 14 to 500 feet, the Dauntlesses dive. The red Hinamaru, the rising sun insignia on the carrier decks below, grows larger with terrifying speed. McCluskey's group splits. He and most of his men target Kaga. Lieutenant Richard Best and his 2 wingmen aim for Akagi. Leslie's Yorktown group heads for Soryu. The carriers, caught while maneuvering and with decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, are sitting ducks. On Kaga, 4 bombs hit. The first obliterates the bridge at 10:22, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and his staff. Another crashes through the flight deck to the hangar, triggering a chain reaction among fueled planes. Fireballs rise. Ammunition detonates. Within minutes, Kaga is a burning tomb. At 10:24, Akagi takes a single bomb dropped by Lieutenant Richard Best. But that one 1,000-pound bomb strikes the upper hangar, igniting 18 aircraft in the middle of refueling and rearming. Torpedoes explode. Bombs ignite. Aviation fuel becomes a rolling wave of fire. Within 2 minutes, the hangar is a furnace. Temperatures exceed 1,000 degrees. Nothing can survive. On Soryu, 3 bombs strike at 10:25. Lieutenant CMDR, Leslie's bombers find their targets with brutal precision. Explosions ripple through the ship, ripping through hangars filled with munitions. On the flight deck, aircraft are shredded. Below, a second hell opens. Captain Ryusaku Yamamoto refuses to abandon his ship. Chief Petty Officer Abe, sent to rescue him, later recalls seeing him on the bridge sword in hand, singing Kimigayo, Japan's national anthem, as flames consume the command tower. Only Hiryu escapes. Separated by several miles and masked by clouds, she is spared for now. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi aboard Hiryu acts immediately. At 10:58, while 3 carriers burn, he launches a counterstrike. 18 Val dive bombers escorted by 6 Zeros led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. At noon, they find Yorktown. Despite heavy resistance, 3 bombs hit. Fires break out. The carrier lists. Dead in the water, damage control teams fight like demons. Incredibly, by 14 hours, Yorktown is steaming at 20 knots again, but Yamaguchi isn't done. At 13:31, he launches again, this time 10 Kate torpedo bombers, 6 Zeros. Among them is Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, returning from the morning strike. Tomonaga's left fuel tank was damaged. There was only time to fuel the right side. When offered another plane, he refused. Every aircraft is needed. He knew it was a one-way flight. At 14:30, Tomonaga's group finds Yorktown again. Fighters tear into them. Tomonaga's plane is hit, burning, but he stays on course. Even aflame, he holds his line and releases his torpedo at the last possible moment. It strikes true. At 14:45, 2 torpedoes slam into Yorktown, opening her port side and causing a 26-degree list. This time, the damage is irreversible, but the hammer blow is yet to fall. At 17:00, 24 dive bombers from Enterprise find Hiryu. At 17:03, 4 bombs land. Fuel tanks erupt. Fires race across her deck. She becomes the 4th burning wreck. Admiral Yamaguchi assembles his crew. On the slanting flight deck, he apologizes. "Live! Rebuild the Navy! Defend the Emperor!" Then, with Captain Tomeo Kaku, he returns to the bridge. Both go down with their ship. In 6 hours, Japan's elite carrier force 4 fleet carriers, their air groups, and many of their best pilots has been annihilated. The Kido Butai, which once ravaged the Pacific, is gone. The tide of the war has turned. Their bodies were never recovered. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi and Captain Tomeo Kaku chose to go down with Hiryu, consumed by fire in the early hours of June 5th. Yamaguchi's final message to Nagumo carried both regret and duty, an apology for the defeat, and a solemn hope for the Emperor's fortune in future battles. He was posthumously promoted to Vice Admiral, a gesture of honor in the face of irrevocable loss. Through the long night of June 4th of 5, the wreckage of the Kido Butai drifted, burned, and bled into the Pacific. Desperate efforts were made to save the ships, but the damage was too great. Soryu slipped beneath the waves at 1913 on June 4th, taking 711 men. Kaga followed just 12 minutes later at 1925 with 801 sailors lost. At Otua on June 5th, reality finally reaches Yamamoto. Still 600 miles away aboard the Yamato, the flagship that never fired a shot in the battle, he gives the signal. Occupation of Midway is canceled. Withdraw. Akagi, stubborn in her death, refuses to sink quickly. Her fires rage through the night. Only at Oro 5 Racht on June 5th, after the last crew had taken off, do Japanese destroyers finish her off with 4 torpedoes. She goes down, taking 267 men. Hiryu burns until 05:10. Then she too is scuttled, claiming 392 lives, including Yamaguchi and Kaku. When the sun rises on June 5th, the once proud elite of the Imperial Navy lies in silence, 17,000 feet beneath the surface. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu gone. 3,057 Japanese sailors and airmen lost. Of these, 2,181 died on the carriers, Akagi, 267 dead, Kaga, 811 dead, Hiryu, 392 dead, Soryu, 701 dead. Another 792 perish when the heavy cruiser Mikuma is sunk, 700, and Mogami is damaged, 92, after a collision and subsequent air attack. Curiously, only 110 of the dead are aircrew. Most pilots were recovered. But the real blow came elsewhere. Over 700 highly trained flight deck personnel and aircraft mechanic specialists whose skills had taken years to cultivate were gone. Their loss would never be recovered. The survivors rescued by destroyers are isolated. No celebrations, no reunions. They are locked away, segregated from the rest of the fleet to contain the secret. But even as the Japanese retreat, the disaster isn't over. On June 6th, Yorktown, barely afloat and under tow by USS Vireo, is located by submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant CMDR Yahachi Tanabe. Having provided weather reports during the battle, Tanabe now creeps through the American destroyer screen at 3 knots. At 13:31, he fires 4 torpedoes from just 1,200 yards. 2 hit Yorktown. A third hits the destroyer USS Hammond, which is supplying power. Hammond splits in 2 and sinks in 4 minutes. 80 men die, many killed by the detonation of her own depth charges. Yorktown, battered but defiant, refuses to sink immediately. She finally rolls over and disappears beneath the sea at 0701 on June 7th, depth 60 and 650 feet. Meanwhile, the battered Japanese cruisers Mikuma and Mogami having collided while avoiding submarine attack attempt to flee. On June 6th, American aircraft find them. Mikuma is destroyed, 700 hands lost, the highest single ship death toll at Midway. Mogami, limping and scarred, escapes with 92 dead, crawling back to truck. The journey home is not one of return, it is one of shame and secrecy. Wounded sailors are hidden away, confined in special compartments aboard ship. They are offloaded under cover of darkness when the fleet arrives at Hashirajima Naval Base on June 14th. There are no parades, no mourning, just silence. Those who survived are placed in naval hospitals under strict guard, quarantined not just from the public, but from their families. Their status classified, their stories forbidden. According to U.S. Naval Institute sources, these men were treated not as veterans, but as failures. Survivors from the air groups are dispatched immediately to distant outposts in the South Pacific. No leave, no contact with home. Most would die in the brutal months to come, in the grinding meat grinder of the Solomon Islands campaign. Carrier crews are scattered among other ships. All are sworn to silence under penalty of punishment. The cover-up begins at once. Official rosters continue to list Akagi and Hiryu as active ships. No admirals are reprimanded, no courts-martial held, because that would mean admitting defeat. Not even the Imperial Army has told the truth for over a month. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo himself is kept unaware of the full extent of the disaster on June 5th, while Akagi still burns Tokyo radio, broadcasts triumph. Naval and air forces of the Empire have succeeded in inflicting heavy damage on American fleet and air forces in the Central Pacific. Later broadcasts falsely claim 2 American carriers sunk. Loss of Kaga is admitted. Soryu is added later. Akagi and Hiryu, never mentioned until after the war. The Japanese public, trusting and unaware, take to the streets in celebration. They are cheering a victory that never was. Only on June 10th does the Tokyo press offer vague hints of difficulties. Even then, the fiction of victory is maintained. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, burned and recovering in hospital, receives a visit from a naval intelligence officer. The message is clear. You are forbidden to speak of what happened. As far as the world knows, we won a great victory. According to post-war accounts, which must be treated cautiously as Fuchida's later testimony has been disputed, he responded with bitter irony, lamenting the futility of constructing a war on lies. But the truth, like the carriers, would remain buried for years. Admiral Yamamoto retreats to his cabin aboard Yamato. He does not emerge for 3 days. At night, staff members hear him pacing, haunted, sleepless, broken. Later, in private diaries, he would confide the weight of his failure. The prophecy he made to Prime Minister Konoe 2 years earlier had come true. I can fight for 6 months, but after that, I have no confidence. Midway had struck exactly 6 months to the day after Pearl Harbor, and the tide had turned. In a closed meeting with his staff, documented by Captain Kuroshima, Yamamoto says simply, "I gambled and lost," and with that loss, the Empire of Japan's rise reached its zenith and began its long, inevitable fall. "In trying to destroy the American carriers," Yamamoto would later write, "I have lost our own. The war is not lost yet, but I fear I have lost the means to win it." To his old friend Rear Admiral Teikichi Hori, Yamamoto would pen a letter that outlived the war one that pierced through propaganda and illusions. Midway was not a defeat of fate or numbers, he admitted. It was a defeat of ourselves. We were overconfident. Our planning was flawed. We underestimated the Americans, and we overestimated ourselves. Now we must pay the price for our arrogance. I give Japan perhaps 18 months before the situation becomes hopeless. Even that bleak forecast was optimistic. 18 months later, Japan had lost the Marianas. American B-29 bombers were flying missions against the home islands. But the real cost of Midway extended far beyond the 4 sunken carriers and over 3,000 dead. It was a death of irreplaceable skill. Japan lost over 100 of its finest aviators' men forged in the crucible of China and the Indian Ocean, veterans who had once outflown every opponent they met. Their training took years. Their instincts took decades. They could not be replaced. But even more critical was the loss of over 700 aircraft mechanics, armorers, and flight deck crews. These were the unseen hands that kept the machinery of war aloft. They knew the sound of a healthy Zero engine from a single cough of its exhaust. They understood the soul of their machines and the rhythm of carrier operations. Their institutional knowledge had taken a generation to build, and in a single morning, it was erased. Admiral Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, would record in his diary later captured and translated words as sobering as any bomb. "We can build new carriers in 2 years. We cannot build new pilots with the experience of those we lost. And we will never replace the maintenance crews who knew how to keep our planes flying in combat." The real tragedy of Midway, he concluded, was not the ships, it was the men. Naval aviation never recovered. 2 years later, in June 1944, Japan would field a new generation of pilots green, poorly trained, and flying inferior aircraft. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea, they faced American veterans in superior machines. The result? Over 600 Japanese aircraft, lost in what the Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The roots of that massacre lay in the waters off Midway. Midway was not just a battle, it was a turning point in thought. Within Japan's Imperial General Headquarters, the illusion of endless conquest began to crumble. Planned invasions of Fiji, Samoa, and even Hawaii were quietly abandoned. Operation FS, the grand strategy to cut America's supply line to Australia, was shelved. Japan shifted from offense to defense, a war it could never hope to win. The Americans, emboldened and vengeful, prepared to strike back. The battle for Guadalcanal, just 2 months away, would ignite a brutal, grinding campaign that would carry them all the way to Tokyo Bay. But perhaps Midway's most profound blow was psychological. Since Tsushima in 1905, the Japanese Navy had wrapped itself in an aura of invincibility. That armor was shattered in 5 minutes. As Commander Tamei Chihara, a destroyer captain, later recalled, "After Midway, we never felt confident again. We went into battle expecting to lose. The Americans went in expecting to win. Everything changed in those 5 minutes when our carriers were hit. Within the Navy, the knives came out. Blame had to fall somewhere publicly. It fell nowhere, but behind closed doors, the recriminations began. Admiral Nagumo, though guilty only of adhering to doctrine, became the scapegoat. He was removed from carrier command, never again allowed to lead at sea. 2 years later, surrounded by American forces on Saipan, he took his own life. Ugaki's diary recorded the judgment. Nagumo is finished. Someone must be blamed. It cannot be Yamamoto. But the rot ran deeper than one admiral. Midway exposed the structural flaws in Japan's military culture, rigidity of thought, a refusal to adapt, blind obedience to doctrine. Even as the tide turned against them, these cultural shackles remained. They would lead to more disasters. Again and again, post-war analysis would reveal the full chain of errors, a tragedy of accumulated failures, an operation too complex, with forces spread across thousands of miles, unable to support one another, radio silence, maintained religiously, that prevented course correction when things went wrong, intelligence failures so glaring they bordered on delusion. Japan had no idea the American carriers were already at sea. America, thanks to its code breakers, knew everything: names, numbers, timing. The reconnaissance effort was pitiful. Just 7 search planes tasked with scanning a vast ocean. Operation K, the planned reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor, was canceled after American warships occupied French frigate shoals. The submarine cordon, meant to spot American carriers, arrived too late. Tone's scout plane, tasked with searching the most critical sector, launched 30 minutes behind schedule. Individually, these may not have spelled doom. Together, they guaranteed it. And worst of all, the Japanese had believed their own myths. They believed their codes were unbreakable. They weren't. They believed Yorktown was out of action. She sailed again in 72 hours. They believed American pilots were inferior. At Midway, they were anything but. They believed the Americans would arrive too late. The Americans were already waiting. Even ship design betrayed them. Japanese carriers with enclosed hangar decks and poor firefighting systems became fire traps. American carriers with open decks and superior damage control proved far more resilient. Yorktown absorbed immense punishment and may have survived had a submarine not finished her. The Japanese carriers, by contrast, burned like matchboxes after a single hit. Yamamoto would not live to see the end of the war. He believed Midway had already lost. On April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid that had precipitated Midway, American codebreakers intercepted his itinerary. P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted his plane over Bougainville and shot it down. He was found in the jungle, still strapped to his seat, his katana by his side. In one of his final letters, Yamamoto wrote with haunting clarity, "At Midway, we learned that wars are not won by spiritual strength alone. They are won by intelligence, both kinds, accurate information, and the wisdom to use it. We had neither. We were too proud to believe the Americans could be waiting, too rigid to adapt when plans unraveled, too arrogant to suspect our codes had been broken. Pride goeth before a fall, and ours was limitless. The result was inevitable. And so the Empire of Japan began its long descent. Its fate sealed not in fire and fury, but in 5 quiet, devastating minutes above the Pacific. The greatest irony of Midway is that it fulfilled Admiral Yamamoto's vision only in reverse. He had long sought a single, decisive engagement, one that would cripple American naval power and secure Japan's dominion in the Pacific. He got it. But it was his fleet that was trapped, his carriers that were destroyed, and his navy that suffered the crushing defeat. The decisive battle the Japanese had envisioned for 40 years finally arrived, and it was the Americans who won it. The doctrine of Kantai Kessen, the climactic fleet battle at sea, had been proven valid, but it served the enemy. Yamamoto had warned of this. In early 1942, he cautioned his staff. A military man can scarcely take pride in striking a sleeping enemy. The shame lies more with the one who is struck. He urged them not to celebrate Pearl Harbor prematurely. Wait to judge until we see what the enemy does, for he will surely strike back hard and soon. And at Midway, that counterstrike came calculated, relentless, and perfectly timed. It was not just a recovery, it was a reversal. The war would continue for 3 more years, but its outcome was decided in 5 explosive minutes on the morning of June 4, 1942. Yet Midway was more than a strategic turning point. It was a profound human tragedy. In the waters 325 miles northwest of Midway, 3,057 Japanese sailors and airmen perished, young men who, only hours before, had sipped tea, read final letters from home, laughed with comrades, and dreamed of victory. They died screaming in flames hotter than furnaces. They drowned in oil-slicked waters or vanished in violent eruptions of steel and fire. Lieutenant Hashimoto, one of Akagi's few survivors, testified after the war. The screams of the burning still echo in my nightmares. We couldn't reach them. The fire blocked every path. The ladders had melted. We could only listen as they died crying for water, for their mothers, for death. The families back home never knew the truth. Official notices told them their sons had died gloriously, bringing honor to the emperor in a great victory. Gold stars were hung in windows. Mothers wept with pride, never realizing the sacrifice had bought not triumph, but defeat. Only after the war did the truth emerge, and with it came betrayal. Many refused to believe it. The deception had been too complete. Petty Officer Tanaka, one of Soryu's few survivors, recalled the morning of June 4th. We were confident, cocky. We joked about who would sink what. Yamada said he'd take out a battleship. Suzuki claimed 5 planes. They were 18 years old. They both died that morning. Their bodies were never found. Sometimes I imagine them still down there, standing at their posts, waiting for orders that will never come. Today, those 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, rest in silence beneath 17,000 feet of Pacific water. Their locations, only recently rediscovered by explorers like Robert Ballard, remain war graves, sacred reminders of hubris and its price. Within their shattered hulls lie the remnants of planes once launched to dominate the Pacific, and the skeletal remains of young men who died believing in a cause that had already failed them. They are eternal sentries in rusted hangars, guardians of vessels that will never sail again. From the Japanese perspective, Midway was the moment when imperial dreams shattered against the hard rock of reality. It was proof that courage cannot replace planning, that spiritual zeal cannot overcome industrial might, that rigid doctrine collapses under fluid warfare. It was Japan's reckoning, and destiny was merciless. The destruction at Midway shattered more than ships and lives. It demolished belief systems, the myth of Japanese invincibility. The conviction that spirit could overcome material disadvantage, the assumption that the enemy would behave exactly as predicted, these died with the carriers. In their place rose a grim realization. Japan had entered a war it could not win, against an enemy it had profoundly misjudged, with strategies already obsolete. Yet, from that ruin, a different Japan would be born, a Japan that turned its back on conquest and embraced peace, a nation that once launched warships, now launched satellites. That once built torpedoes, now built cars and computers, that transformed the samurai's tenacity into technological leadership. And in that transformation, perhaps, the men who died at Midway did not perish in vain. Midway remains a warning etched in steel and salt. The Japanese Navy, despite its daring, brilliance, and bravery, was undone by its own success. Victory disease, the fatal belief that what worked once will always work, had taken root. Arrogance blinded leaders to intelligence, doctrine replaced adaptability, and hubris silenced doubt. The Navy, that had stunned the world at Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier, now stumbled into disaster. Basic reconnaissance was bungled, intelligence warnings were ignored, code breaking was dismissed, and an ambush meant for the enemy became their own undoing. As we revisit Midway through Japanese eyes, we do not see monsters, but men. Pilots who soared to their deaths, driven by duty commanders making choices with fractured information, mechanics working feverishly on aircraft that would never fly again, sailors who stayed at their stations until fire or flood took them. Their story is not one of glory, but of cost. Not a celebration, but a remembrance. Perhaps no post-war figure embodied that transformation more than Commander Mitsuo Fuchida. Yes, his later writings must be viewed cautiously. Yes, his post-war accounts are riddled with inconsistencies. But even so, his journey from the lead pilot at Pearl Harbor to a Christian evangelist preaching reconciliation mirrors Japan's own path, from aggression to pacifism, from empire to democracy, from isolation to cooperation. Midway's final lesson is stark and eternal. No nation, no matter how proud or powerful, can afford to underestimate its enemies, overestimate its own strength, or cling to outdated ways of war. At Pearl Harbor, Japan's carriers were invincible. At Midway, they proved fatally vulnerable. Their best pilots, once unstoppable, were outflown by Americans they thought inferior. Their strategies, once hailed, collapsed under the weight of changing tides. The waters that closed over Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu were more than tombs. They were cleansing, washing away militarism, arrogance, and illusions. The young men who died believed they were serving emperor and empire. They could not know they were also unintentionally laying the foundation for a different Japan, a peaceful Japan, a better Japan. Their sacrifice, though born of error, taught a lesson written in fire and blood, that empires fall not by external conquest alone, but from internal blindness, that the true enemy of any nation is not always outside, but within: pride, inflexibility, and the refusal to change. This is the story of Midway from the Japanese perspective. A tale of strategy turned to ashes, of pride before the fall, of young lives extinguished in the name of dreams that could not be realized. It is not a story of victory or defeat. It is a story of remembrance. For in the end, the sea does not care who was right. It remembers only the silence left behind. And in the vast Pacific, where the wreckage lies, only the waves remain, whispering the cost of war and the value of peace.